The day my marriage ended, I was standing in the driveway holding a casserole dish. Not a suitcase. Not a court document. A casserole dish, the ceramic one with the blue rim that my mom gave me when we got married. The one I'd carried carefully through 2 vuvus and 1 flooded apartment. My husband had just told me, very calmly, the way you'd explain a change in cable service, that he wanted me out by the end of the month, that he'd found someone else, that he was sorry, but he wasn't, and we both knew it. I stood there in the driveway with that dish in my hands, and I didn't say a word. I just got in my car and drove. His name was, well, I'll call him what he was, my ex-husband. We'd been together since I was 26. 4 years total, 3 of them married. I thought we were building something. He thought he was waiting for something better. He found it, apparently, in a 23-year-old named Brittany, who worked in his firm's marketing department, and laughed at all his jokes. Good for her. The divorce itself was fast. Too fast, looking back. He had a lawyer lined up before I even found a therapist. He had documents. He had a plan. I had the casserole dish and a slowly dawning horror that I had signed a post-nuptial agreement 2 years into our marriage during a rough patch, when I thought it would help us rebuild trust. It didn't rebuild anything. It just made his exit cleaner. The agreement gave me a lump sum, $3,500, and whatever personal items I could fit in my car. No claim on the house we'd bought together. No share of the business he'd grown during our marriage. Partly because I had quit my job to support his schedule, to travel with him, to be the person who remembered his mother's birthday and picked up his dry cleaning, and made sure there was always something in the refrigerator that wasn't leftover takeout. $3,500. My attorney, I did eventually find one, a tired woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who told me gently but directly that I should have had independent counsel before signings, reviewed everything, and said the agreement would likely hold. I could fight it. It would cost more than I'd win. I took the $3,500. I hated myself for it. I moved out on a Wednesday. I found a place in a neighborhood called Maple Creek, outside of Denver. It was the kind of neighborhood that used to be nice, and was working its way back. My rental was a half of a duplex. 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a window that faced a side yard, a bathroom with a shower head that ran cold for the first 40 seconds every morning. The landlord, a retired postal worker named Mr. Finch, who lived across the street, told me it was a quiet block. He wasn't wrong. My neighbors on the other half of the duplex were a couple I almost never saw. The house next door sat empty for the first 3 weeks. Then someone moved in quietly. No moving truck that I noticed, just a beat-up blue pickup in the driveway one morning and lights on in the evenings. I didn't introduce myself. I was in the middle of what I can only describe as a controlled collapse. I went to work. I'd picked up a part-time administrative job at a physical therapy clinic. I came home. I ate cereal for dinner more nights than I'd like to admit, and I watched a lot of television. I cried on Sundays. I called my mom on Tuesdays. I did not, under any circumstances, cry on the phone with my mom. She would have driven from Albuquerque in 4 hours flat, and I wasn't ready for that kind of love yet. It would have undone me completely. It was a Thursday in October when I first actually spoke to the man next door. I had locked myself out. Not romantically, not dramatically. I had taken out the recycling in my socks. The door had swung shut behind me, and I was standing in the side yard in October in my socks, holding an empty cardboard box, when I realized I'd left my phone on the counter. I knocked on Mr. Finch's door. No answer. I walked around to the front and stood there trying to figure out my next move. And then the door to the house next door opened and a man stepped out to get his mail. He was maybe 35 tall, with the kind of build that suggested he'd done physical work at some point in his life and hadn't stopped. He had a scar along his left jaw that I noticed and then made myself not stare at. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans and boots that had actual mud on them, which struck me as slightly out of place on our quiet Denver street. He saw me standing there in my socks. He didn't laugh. He just said, "You okay?" "I locked myself out," I said. "I'm fine. I'll figure it out. Do you need a phone?" I looked at him. He looked at me. And then, because it was cold and my socks were thin and I had about $17 in checking until my next paycheck, I said yes. His name was Cole. He told me that while he handed me his phone through the gap in the doorway, He didn't invite me in, which I actually appreciated because it didn't feel intrusive. He just said, "I'm Cole, by the way. Next door." "I know," I said. "I saw your truck." He nodded like that was a perfectly normal thing to say. I called a locksmith. 20 minutes. Cole stood on his porch while I waited on mine, not making conversation, just present. When the locksmith came and I'd gotten back inside, I leaned out the door and called over "thank you." He raised a hand from where he was sitting on his front step and went back to looking at whatever he was reading. That was it. That was our whole first conversation. He came over 3 days later with a pot of soup. I was not expecting that. I opened the door in my work clothes at 6:30 p.m., exhausted, still wearing my coat, and he was standing there holding a Dutch oven with oven mitts. "I made too much," he said. "Chicken and wild rice. I saw your car in the driveway, so I figured you were home." I stared at him. I said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. He held out the pot. "Oven mitts come back when you're done." I returned the Dutch oven 2 days later, washed and dried. He was in his driveway doing something under the hood of the truck. I said thank you again. He said anytime. I went back inside. That was November. Over the next several weeks, a strange thing happened. We fell into something that I could only call a rhythm, though neither of us ever named it or planned it. If I came home and he was outside, we'd talk for 10 minutes. Sometimes 15. Never long. He didn't ask personal questions. I didn't volunteer personal information. He told me he'd done 2 tours overseas, Army, and that he'd been back for a few years now, working mostly remote doing something in logistics that he described as reading a lot of spreadsheets. He said it with a slight smile, like he knew that wasn't the whole picture but wasn't going to elaborate. He had a dog, a big tan shepherd mix named Huck, who treated me like I was the most important person on the block from our very first introduction, and continued to act that way every single time he saw me, which I found deeply comforting in a period of my life when very little felt unconditional. I did not tell Cole about my ex-husband. I did not tell him about the post-nuptial agreement or the $3,500 or the Brittany from the marketing department. I talked about nothing. He talked about nothing. We stood in the cold air between our 2 houses and talked about the neighbors and the weather, and once, memorably, about the relative merits of different kinds of coffee makers. A conversation I still think about sometimes because he had opinions about this that were completely unexpected and somehow entirely consistent with everything I knew about him. December came. I drove home for Christmas and spent 2 weeks in my childhood bedroom in Albuquerque and let my mom feed me tamales and asks me gentle questions I mostly didn't answer. She didn't push. She never pushed. She just refilled my plate and let me sit with the dog on the couch and watched old movies with me until we fell asleep. My dad asked me once, quietly, when we were doing dishes, if I was okay. I said I was getting there. He dried a plate and didn't say anything else, and I have never loved him more than I did in that moment. I came back to Denver in January. Cole's truck was in the driveway. Huck barked once when I carried boxes in, and then I heard Cole's voice through the wall, low, calming him down. I stood in my kitchen and felt, for the first time in months, like I was actually glad to be back somewhere. That was a strange thing to notice. I filed it away. My ex-husband called in February. I had not spoken to him since the papers were finalized. I saw his name on my phone and I sat with it for 3 full rings before I answered. Because I'm not the kind of person who doesn't answer, even when I should be. He was calling, he said, because he'd heard I was struggling. I asked him how he'd heard that. He said a mutual friend had mentioned it. I knew exactly which mutual friend. Someone who had always been more his than mine, and who had apparently appointed herself his news service. He said he was worried about me. He said he hoped I was doing okay. He said, and I want to be precise here because I have thought about this phrasing many times. I just want to make sure you're not doing anything stupid. I said, goodbye, and I hung up. And then I sat down on my kitchen floor. Just sat down, right there on the linoleum, and I shook. Not crying, just shaking. Because that was the voice that had told me I was enough for 4 years while slowly, methodically making me less. That was the voice that had handed me a post-nuptial agreement and said, it's just a formality, and watched me sign it. That was the voice that said, I want you out by the end of the month the way you'd describe a change in cable service. Huck scratched at the shared wall from the other side. I don't know if he heard me sit down or if it was coincidence, but he scratched once and then again, and I put my palm flat against the wall and I breathed. Cole knocked on my door 20 minutes later. He didn't say he'd heard anything. He just said he was going for a walk and asked if I wanted to come. He said Huck needed the exercise and would I mind. I put on my coat and my boots, and I walked 6 blocks in the February cold with a man I barely knew and his large faithful dog, and neither of us said a single word about anything important, and it was the best I'd felt in months. Spring came in a way that felt deliberate. Crocuses in the side yard, the light staying past 5 and then past 6. I started running in the mornings, something I hadn't done since before the marriage. I got promoted at the clinic. Actual promotion, not just a title change, with a raise that made a real difference. I called my mom and she cried a little. I cried a little too. Cole started leaving his door open in the evenings when the temperature was above 50. I could hear the radio sometimes. Classic rock, old stuff, the kind of thing that made me think of my dad's garage when I was a kid. One evening, I knocked and asked if he had a wrench I could borrow, because something under my sink was dripping. He came over and looked at it and fixed it in 11 minutes. I offered to pay him, and he looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't speak. He stayed for coffee. Just coffee. We sat at my kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about things I can't fully reconstruct now. His family, a little, somewhere in Montana. His sister who was getting remarried and the complicated feelings he had about that. My work at the clinic. A trip I wanted to take to the Oregon coast that I'd been putting off because it felt wrong to do something like that alone. Why wrong? He said. I thought about it. I said I didn't know, actually. It just felt like something you did with someone. He said, you go places alone all the time. I said that was different. He said, is it? I didn't have a good answer. He left around 10. I washed the coffee cups and stood at the sink and looked out at the side yard, at the crocuses giving way to something else now. Tulips maybe, and I felt something that I was not ready to name, so I didn't name it. I dried my hands and went to bed. My ex-husband showed up in April, not called. Showed up. I came home from work on a Thursday to find his car, the silver Audi that I had spent 4 years watching him polish every Saturday morning, like it was a ritual, parked on my street. He was standing on my porch. I sat in my car for a minute. Then I got out. He looked good. That was the first thing I noticed, and I resented noticing it. He had the easy confidence of a man who had moved on without friction, and who wanted me to see that. He was holding flowers. Not grocery store flowers, real ones. The kind from the florist downtown that he used to bring me early in our relationship, and then stopped without explanation. He said he'd made a mistake. I said nothing. He said Brittany hadn't worked out. He said he'd been thinking about us. About what we'd had, about how good we'd been. He said the word comfortable like it was a compliment. He said maybe we could talk. I said, I'd like you to leave. He blinked. I don't think he'd considered that possibility. He said, just hear me out. I've heard you out, I said. For 4 years. I'd like you to leave my property. He started to say something else, and then Cole's front door opened. He didn't come over. He didn't say anything. He just stepped out onto his porch with a cup of coffee and looked at us with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who had nowhere to be and all the time in the world. Huck sat beside him. My ex-husband looked at Cole. Cole looked at my ex-husband. Then Cole looked at me, and the question in his expression was clear as anything. Do you want me to come over? I shook my head just barely. He nodded. He stayed on his porch. Something about that. About having him there, not intervening, not inserting himself, just being a witness, gave me the steadiness I needed. I said to my ex-husband, if you come back here, I'll call the police. I mean that. He left. He didn't look back. I stood on my porch for a moment and then I looked at Cole. He raised his coffee cup slightly. I laughed, actually laughed, surprised by it. I went inside. He texted me an hour later. He said, you okay? I wrote back, yeah, thank you for staying put. He wrote, Huck's good at staying put. Me too, when it matters. That was the first time we texted. The conversations changed after that, or maybe I changed, or maybe I finally stopped pretending I didn't know what I was feeling. We started talking more. He came over for dinner twice in May. I went with him to a farmer's market on a Saturday, and we walked around for 2 hours, and he bought tomatoes, and I bought a small lavender plant in a terracotta pot, and he carried it back to the car for me without making a thing of it. I put the lavender on my kitchen windowsill. It started to grow in a way my old lavender never had. Not because of anything special I did, just because the light was right. Just because the conditions were finally right. I told him about the marriage in June. All of it. The post-nuptial, the 3,500, the casserole dish in the driveway, the phone call where my ex-husband told me not to do anything stupid. Cole listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He told me that the logistics company he'd described as reading spreadsheets was a company he'd co-founded after he got back from his second tour, that he'd built it with 2 other veterans, that it had grown steadily, that 18 months ago they'd been acquired. He said it quietly and without drama, the way he said most things. He said he told me because he didn't want me to feel, later, like he'd hidden it. He said he wasn't the same as my ex-husband. He said he knew I had no reason to believe that yet, but he wanted to be clear about who he was. I looked at him. I said, "Why now?" He said, "Because I think I'm falling in love with you, and I didn't want there to be anything between us that wasn't honest." The lavender was on the windowsill. The light was exactly right. My ex-husband found out about Cole in August. I don't know how, exactly. Word travels, especially through the particular network of mutual acquaintances that a 4-year relationship builds. What I know is that he showed up, again. This time not at my house but at the clinic where I worked, which felt like a different kind of violation. He came in during my lunch break and sat in the waiting room and asked the receptionist to tell me he was there. I came out. He stood up. He looked different this time, less polished, a little undone. He said he'd heard I was seeing someone. He said he wanted to know who. He said he just wanted to understand. I said, "That's not something you get to understand," he said, "after everything we went through. After everything you did," I said, keeping my voice low because we were in a medical waiting room and I am not a person who makes scenes. "You don't get information about my life anymore. You gave that up." He said something about the postnuptial. He said he'd been thinking and maybe there was a way to revisit the terms. He said he'd talk to his lawyer. Something clicked into place. I said, "I'll have my attorney call yours." He blinked. I walked back through the door into the clinic. That night, Cole and I sat on my porch in the August heat and I told him everything. He listened, and then he said something that I wrote down later because I wanted to remember it exactly. He said, "He's not interested in being fair. He's interested in controlling what the story looks like." That was it. That was exactly it. I hired my attorney back the next morning. I explained everything. The postnuptial, the original terms, the meeting at the clinic, the suggestion about revisiting. She said she'd make some calls. What happened over the next 6 weeks I learned mostly secondhand in pieces. My attorney made calls. Cole. And this is the part I found out only later, when he told me. Had a conversation with his own attorney. Because it turned out there were some financial arrangements from the years of our marriage that my attorney hadn't known to look for. Consulting contracts that ran through a company in my name that I'd never been told about. It wasn't fraud exactly. Or if it was the careful kind that looks like an accounting decision. But it was the kind of thing that, once surfaced, changes the terms of a conversation considerably. When my ex-husband's attorney got my attorney's letter, the one that mentioned what had been found, he called my attorney the same afternoon. A new settlement was reached. I'm not going to give specific numbers. What I will say is that $3,500 became a number with considerably more digits, and a house I never thought I'd see again. Became a house I could sell and didn't have to. And there was a non-disclosure provision which I signed, because some settlements come with those. And because I wanted it to be over more than I wanted anyone to know the details. My ex-husband called me once more after that. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. That was the last time I heard from him. There's a version of this story where I tell you it was all because of Cole, his connections, his resources, the way a man with the right background can open doors. And that's not untrue. But it's also not the whole story. The whole story is that I had already said no in my own driveway. I had already said, "Get off my property." I had already walked back through that door at the clinic. Cole didn't give me a backbone. I had one. He just stood on his porch with his dog and made sure I knew someone was watching. That's different. That matters. In a way I'm still learning to explain. We drove to the Oregon coast in October. Finally. It took 2 days each way, and we split the driving and argued exactly once about which podcast to listen to. A conflict we resolved by listening to neither and spending 4 hours talking instead. We stayed in a small house near Cannon Beach that Cole had found and booked without making a production of it, the way he did most things. The Pacific was gray and enormous and cold. We walked on the beach every morning before the fog lifted. On the second morning, he held my hand. Just like that. He didn't ask or announce it. He just reached over and held my hand, and we kept walking. I thought about the casserole dish. I thought about the driveway and the calm voice telling me I had until the end of the month. I thought about the floor of my kitchen in February, the shaking, the palm pressed flat against the wall. I thought about the lavender plant on the windowsill, growing because the conditions were finally right. The fog was coming in off the water, thick and salt-smelling. The beach stretched out ahead of us, long and gray and wide open. Huck ran ahead, looping back every few minutes to check on us, loyal and uncomplicated and completely sure of where he belonged. I tightened my hand around Cole's, and I kept walking.